Life after COVID-19, lessons from past pandemics surveys historic epidemics and pandemics of infectious diseases, searching for insight into our future and our lives in the wake of COVID-19. Final thoughts. This is a good point that I neglected to make. With the prevalence of working from home, there'll be a great deal of vacant office space, with the potential to be turned into residential accommodation. And this may sound a bit unlikely at first glance, but a modern high-rise is a series of pancakes of concrete. The interior walls are all partitioned. They can be reconfigured in a million different ways. And in fact, the city of Calgary in late December took an order to council allowing the conversion of commercial space to residential. And when I started researching this, I discovered that the corporation involved had already undertaken similar conversions in Edmonton, a second city in Alberta. See, Alberta its economy is entirely based on fossil fuels. So its offices have been in the tank for about 5 years. And Edmonton has already approved and seen completed office towers converted into residential rental property. The move to telework may actually indirectly positively impact the housing crises that afflict New York, Vancouver, Toronto, and London. The most significant impact of COVID-19, for convenience sake, I refer to as tele-everything. In a sense, what it refers to is all forms of electronically mediated interaction. In a similar sense, what we call the Black Death, contemporaries referred to as the Terrible Death. Similarly, the Spanish flu actually had nothing to do with Spain whatsoever. And I mean it in the sense that I refer to carrying my phone in my pocket. But in fact, I send and receive text, files, emails far more frequently than I take telephone calls. So, tele-everything. First category, telework. The idea of the office, the beehive of activity, I think has been demolished as a model for the working of a modern organization. In a sense, what I'm saying is, traditionally, face-to-face has been the presumed means of interaction. And a phone call, an email was suitable, but not as nuanced as face-to-face. The pandemic has demonstrated that, in fact, the office was becoming redundant. And the concept of employees working from their own homes, but electronically linked, was given up a huge push by the pandemic. And the key point with this is that it offers both benefits to both the employer and the employee, which is why I believe it will be one of the changes that will endure. From the employee's point of view, I think it's self-evident. A commute, whether it's 40 minutes or 3 hours, is essentially unpaid labor. There's also a better opportunity for parenting, for work-life balance, for a host of quality of life advantages for the employee. For the employer, though, the benefits are truly astonishing. In 2019 in Manhattan, commercial real estate cost $169.50 per year. That meant a 10 by 10 office cost $17,000. The savings, I think, start to become evident, and particularly so when one considers that some of the largest banks and brokerage houses in the United States rent as much as 2 or 3 million square feet of office space in Manhattan. The cost savings to the employer will be huge. There are, of course, concerns that are beginning to emerge about monitoring employees working at home. Are they getting enough keystrokes in per hour? Are they actually staring at the screen? And I hearken back to 140 years ago when industrialization started. Labor reforms will be developed. I mean, there'll be initially a push for all kinds of surveillance. And in fact, what'll happen is it'll become a health and safety issue. And trade unions and management will battle it out. But I assure you, in a decade, a huge percentage of white-collar employees and call center employees, anybody that doesn't have to be in the office won't be. How it shakes out in terms of employee rights and what have you remains to be seen. But the shift away from the office to working from home is here to stay and will have profound impacts. Consider, for instance, already, both in London and in Toronto in Canada, condominium prices of rentals and to buy in strata living or compounded housing in urban cores are already dropping in price. At the same time, prices and demand are rising in the exurbs, and distances that would have been impractical to commute are now practical. An individual can work for a corporation headquartered in downtown Toronto and live 100 miles north in cottage country. It's a beautiful option for those it's available to. Of course, the flip side of that is many, particularly low-wage jobs, can't be done remotely. A construction laborer can't frame walls electronically. An Amazon driver can't deliver his packages electronically. So there will definitely be a class divide. But for those who can, telework will prevail and have impacts on the price of real estate. One of the positive impacts may be with less commuting and similarly less business air travel, the environment stands to win big from this shift. And it's already evident in air quality index measurements, even in photographs of urban areas today and a year ago. The change is astonishing. The second area everything will impact is the practice of medicine. The idea of visiting your doctor's office, unless it's absolutely essential, will disappear. And again, the benefits work on both sides of the equation. For the doctor, it will be, I think, more efficient. I think a volume of phone appointments that could be handled in a day far exceeds face-to-face visits. Not to say that the care would be any less, but the mechanics of shuffling into the office and getting weighed and yada yada would vanish. Most importantly, if we're dealing with infectious respiratory illness, not assembling patients in a waiting room is an essential public health measure. It's safer for everyone if a phone appointment will handle the issue, that it be the preferred alternative to trekking to the doctor's office, sitting in the waiting room. So again, both the patient and the practitioner, I think, will find benefits from telemedicine. The third thing is teleeducation. Of necessity, we've seen it employed during the pandemic. And again, it's not a new trend. It was already occurring, but the pandemic has compressed a decade's change into 6 months. This again raises a real estate question. If educational institutions from middle school to graduate school shift at least some of their course offerings online, they will have huge quantities of physical plant they no longer require. This shift has already started, and in fact, it's been suggested here in my home province of Ontario that the vacant schools be employed as testing centers, vaccination centers, and even as isolation units for people diagnosed positive whose living circumstances don't permit them to properly quarantine in their home. Moving on to the next field, there are a series of interlinked businesses that are going to be ravaged by the pandemic. And I'm referring, of course, to hospitality, entertainment, and travel. The airline industry will be dealing with extraordinary issues. An aircraft is essentially an isolated aluminum cigar employing recirculated air through the length of your flight. SARS-CoV-1 aerosolized. That's how patient 1 infected the other guests on his floor in the Hotel Metropole in Hong Kong. We know COVID-19 aerosolizes. In other words, it'll be blowing through the aircraft repeatedly. Issues about filtering have been raised but have yet to be solved. And again, this applies also to strata living and condominiums in major urban areas. But to return, so the airline industries are facing a huge problem. The second problem beyond the issue of air circulation is that most flights, or many flights, are international. And right now, countries with quarantine rules and again, with the employment shift to virtual meetings, business travel will evaporate. No one will bother flying from London to Berlin for a 2-hour meeting and to fly back that evening. Again, it doesn't make sense for the corporation. It discomforts and inconveniences the employee. So the airline industry is heading towards a huge crisis. I don't dare predict the outcome, but I assure you, the airline industry will have a different geography in 3-5 years. This then extends more broadly into the hospitality industry. Working from home, people don't have to go out for lunch. Wall Street has already seen this. The bars and restaurants that expected to be 4 deep with traders are simply empty. In fact, one became a favorite haunt of the Proud Boys. The business model that most hospitality industries operate from has a razor-thin margin. Even if restaurants, movie theaters, particularly live theater, music venues, if they're permitted to open but required to maintain physical distancing, we're looking at 35%, 40% occupancy. The problem is, at least I know for certain, in the live theater business, 65% occupancy is the line between profitability and failure. If it's legislated that they can only fill themselves to 35% capacity, the business model is not there. And again, that will apply to live theater, cinema, restaurants, bars and pubs. That industry faces absolute mayhem. To return to the issue of condos, the idea of telework is going to hit the condo business. But there's a host of other problems that are going to arise that'll have a profound impact potentially on the housing crisis that cities in the UK, Canada, and the United States are all dealing with. Unaffordable rents in urban areas, homelessness. Many condominiums were purchased for investment, not as a primary residence. Those investors had a selection of potential tenants they could eye. One option was Airbnb, short-term rentals. With the travel industry underground, there are not going to be any Airbnb customers anymore. Ditto with no business travel. It's very unlikely to be that client base. Other investors purchased. I know this to be particularly true of Toronto and London, planning to rent them or lease them to international students. Again, with the travel restrictions, the quarantine rules, with schools shifting to online learning, that market has essentially evaporated. So there's going to be a plethora of condominium investors forced to sell at the same time that new condominiums that can't be sold are coming onto the market. There will be a huge oversupply, which inevitably will see prices drop substantially.